This is History Unit 2, Lesson 12, Interpreting History and Writing an Argument. Prior to Lesson 12, remember that students have already interpreted a timeline about Vietnam and read a chapter about Vietnam. And in this lesson, they're going to read multiple documents about the Tonkin Gulf incident, and they're going to answer 3 questions that are subject to debate among historians even today. They will use text evidence to come up with their own arguments in answer to one of the 3 questions. There are quite a few materials that go along with this lesson. The Tonkin Gulf Crisis by Gareth Porter, who is a historian. Fact or Fiction, a Rebuttal by Douglas Pike. Now, the Tonkin Gulf Crisis was written in a newspaper, and the next issue of the paper had this rebuttal by Douglas Pike about the information in Gareth Porter's article. Secrets of the Vietnam War by Philip B. Davidson. This is an excerpt from a book that he had self-published. And the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is from a textbook chapter. It's an excerpt from a textbook chapter that's used in college. As I Saw It, this is an excerpt from Dean Rust's book, As I Saw It, where he addresses what happened during the Tonkin Gulf incident. And The Fog of War, which is a video. Senator Wayne Morse Says No to Vietnam, which is another video. And they're also going to be listening to a phone call by Robert S. McNamara. So those are some of the documents that they're going to be reading. The 3 questions are, did the Johnson administration deliberately incite the Gulf of Tonkin incident? And there are some historians say that that is true, and some say it is not true. At issue actually is what really happened on August 4th, 1964. And the final question is, did Johnson knowingly use a questionable report of an attack to escalate the war? These 3 questions, as I said, are open to debate among historians. So to give you a little background, this is a paragraph that will orient you to the Tonkin Gulf incident, which is the event in the Vietnam conflict that is the subject of this lesson. On August 2nd, 3 North Vietnamese PT boats fired at the destroyer USS Maddox as it was on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, the Maddox again patrolled those waters along with another U.S. vessel, the Sea Turner Joy, where there was a report of another attack. Word of the report led President Johnson to retaliate, and he asked Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which allowed him to escalate the conflict without asking Congress to declare war. So here's a paragraph that will help, that will help orient you to the Tonkin Gulf incident, which is the topic of this lesson. You can read it. Essentially what happened in 2 separate days, August 2nd and August 4th. On August 2nd, historians are pretty sure that what happened was the USS Maddox, which was a destroyer in North Vietnamese waters, was on patrol and was hit by some PT boats. 2 days later, the Maddox was accompanied by the Sea Turner Joy. There was a report of an attack. However, the report was not verified, and there were lots of confusing messages about what really happened that day. But word of the report led President Johnson to retaliate, and because of this, he asked Congress to pass the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And that allowed him to escalate the conflict without asking Congress to declare war, which is why we call it the Vietnam conflict and not the Vietnam War. It never was a declared war. In Activity 1, students read about their task, including the 3 questions they're to answer, and they talk to each other to make sure that they've understood what they're being asked to do. Now, so when they're talking about the task, they should be able to describe what kinds of information they'd be looking for to answer the questions, and you can have a discussion with them about this. And they're also going to use 2 different notes organizers. These will help them organize the information that they're reading. And one of them is to help them decide the credibility of the arguments, and the other to help them keep track of the evidence. So students should work together to come to consensus about their answer to each question. Here's an example. It's a part of the graphic organizer that gets them to think about the author and the author's credibility. So this you might recognize: the speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, tone. Those have been used in previous lessons. The last column there says, credible, is the perspective in this document something that you can trust? Why or why not? So they answer that question too. And along the in the left-hand column, those are the different readings that they're going to be using in this lesson. And here is a piece of the notes organizer that they're going to be using, sort of truncated here. And this is one question. So, did the Johnson administration deliberately incite the Gulf of Tonkin incident? If they're going to say, if Gareth Porter would say yes, or if Gareth Porter would say no. In that box, they're going to be telling you what they did say in relation to that question. And when they get done, our view is that column in the center. They're going to ask that question, they're going to answer that question and come to consensus with their partner on that question based upon the evidence that they've read. And some of this evidence is going to be on the yes side, and some of the evidence is going to be on the no side. So they will have to determine what evidence is the best and how credible it is. Well, I've done this activity a number of times, and I can tell you that it may be that a student won't be able to come to consensus with the other 3 students in their group. That's okay, but then that person becomes the minority opinion and is responsible for detailing their differences in opinion from their group. So remember, we have 2 pairs that each came to consensus on their own. Now, it could be that those 2 pairs disagree. One will say yes to the question, and then the other will say no to the question. And if they do disagree, what they should be doing at that point is reviewing the evidence and pointing out what others may have missed that would be more convincing in order to get them to come to consensus. But it's possible too that those 2 pairs answered the same way. And if they do that, what they're going to be spending their time in is discussing what evidence is most compelling, because they may have relied on different sources of evidence to come to that consensus, and so they're going to have to sort through that evidence. So with the whole group discussion, depending upon the time you have, you might want to focus on just one question at a time. And after reading the documents, there are some questions that are provided in the lesson in the teacher's guide. So if the whole group discussion has missed some of the points, you might want to return to those questions and get students engaged in answering those questions. Again, those questions are on page 591 to 592 of the teacher's guide. And I would strongly suggest that you read those questions ahead of time so you can decide on what you will ask depending upon how the discussion goes. If you don't know what are in those questions, when you hear students in the discussion, you might not know which ones they're missing out on. In activity 4, students are going to prepare to write an argument. So they're going to read an excerpt before they do of historical arguments to decide the features of a good one. And then they're going to read an example of historical argument to some of the to learn some good ways to embed evidence. That's one of the hard things that students have to learn, is how to embed evidence that they've gotten from their reading into an argument that they're writing. So they're going to see a model of that. This activity mirrors a DBQ, except that there are more documents. Some of the documents are longer. So what students are going to do to prepare is they're going to read 2 responses from a DBQ and decide which is best and why. And when they do that, you should help them pull out the features that make an argument better. And you could actually have, write down these features in a list and put it on a chart in the room so that they can pay attention to that when they're writing their own arguments. And the other thing they're going to read is a historian's argument and pay attention to the way that historian embeds the evidence. Again, your job is to help students see the features of that embedded evidence so that they can copy those features so they know how to use those in their own writing. And there are some suggestions on page 600 of the teacher's guide to help them do the writing. The idea is for students not just to drop in a quote, but to provide some context and some reasoning for the evidence they're bringing into the papers. This is really hard for students to do, and it's important that they get practice in doing that. In activity 5, students actually write the argument and they evaluate the argument using a typical DBQ evaluation. So what I would do is I would give students the rubric before they write the paper. That way they can see what kinds of elements are important in writing the paper, and they should do a better job if they've done that. When they get finished writing their arguments, they're going to be evaluating them. So while they're doing that, you can circulate around the room and ask students to explain their ratings with examples from their papers. That will get them thinking about, in a little deeper way, about the kinds of things that they've been doing in their writing. And then they can use their evaluations to guide a rewrite of their papers, which if you would want, they can do as homework. And that's the end of the discussion of Lesson 12. I think this is going to be a really interesting lesson for students. I've used it with students before. Always gets a lot of discussion and thinking going, and it is truly more like the work of historians and some of the other lessons that they've done.